Hello and welcome to the In Conversation series by Azim Premji University. My name is Malini Bhattacharjee and I teach at Azim Premji University. And today I am delighted to introduce a very special guest, Dr. Hindol Sengupta, who's come to talk to us about his work. A brief introduction about Hindol. Dr. Hindol Sengupta is a multiple award-winning historian and author of 12 books. He was trained as a filmmaker at the Mass Communication Research Center, Jamia Millia Islamia, and in History, International Relations and Business as a Chevening Scholar at Oxford, and a Knight Bagehot Fellow at Columbia University. He has a doctorate in International Relations from the Geneva School of Diplomacy. He is a World Economic Forum Young Global Leader. Thank you so much, Hindol, for joining us today.
Thank you, Malini. Welcome. Thank you. Delighted to be here.
And I want to begin first by asking you about taking you back rather to your childhood and giving us a sense of some of the formative influences that went behind making you the author, historian that you are today.
No, first let me say thank you, Malini. Just Hindol, please. I'm delighted to be back in Bangalore. It's if I didn't live in Delhi, I always say I would have lived in Bangalore, though the traffic is what it is. However, I'm always very happy to be invited in an academic surrounding, because I think there is so much misinformation in our world. It's very important to engage, especially with younger people and students, to try and ensure that some semblance of balance somewhere peeps in. You just asked me about my childhood and my formative influences. Many things, actually. I mean, of course, without meaning to sound parochial, I guess being a Bengali helped somewhere. But I think perhaps it was more than that. My mother always had a very keen interest in literature and writing and so on and so forth. But, in a classic tale of the times, she couldn't really do much with that interest because of all kinds of sort of societal reasons, right? And that's very unfortunate. Thankfully, times have changed. We're in a different world. That's where a lot of my work, I would think of, including my latest book, is about the idea of freedom. Emancipation is important to me. How do human beings become free? In what shape and form? How do they seek that freedom? How do they acquire that freedom? What does freedom mean to them? All of this is really important to me. And I remember, and thank you very much once again for calling me here, I remember talking to you a few years ago at a different event where we first met. We were discussing, freedom in a different context, so to speak, right? I have always been fascinated with that idea. And I think today more than ever before, with the age of AI, with polarization, I recently gave a TED talk where I tried to ask, what is really free will? And in fact, it doesn't really exist. Human beings are becoming more and more tied to various sort of notions of self. Some derived from their own experiences, much derived from mobile phones and the information they're consuming. And what is their free will and what is their real opinion is in fact disappearing. And I think my work tries to address it in some small, humble way.
You've invoked the word freedom and what it means to be free, I think in other contexts as well. And the little bit of work that I have read of yours, and there's a book called The Liberals, a very interesting one, which is, I think, a series of essays. And, when I first opened up that book, I actually thought it's probably a take on the liberals or the idea of liberalism or what it rather means to be liberal. But I was actually pleasantly surprised to see it. We'll come back to the book a little later. But, I'm somebody who works and is deeply interested in the entanglement between religion and politics. And I have often wondered if it is possible to be free, not liberal, without a liberal paradigm or a liberal framework, so to speak, right? So to explain myself better, are there limits to this secular liberal framework that we all love to celebrate? And given the Eurocentric education system that all of us come from, is there a parallel universe out there? Are there communitarian value systems, for example, that also talk about freedom, that also talk about gender equality, but perhaps use a very different vocabulary?
So, in my opinion, the fundamental flaw, today, of course, there is a lot of work being done on, the primary errors of this so-called, Western secular framework. One of the critiques of this work is a critique of the notion of individuality or individualism, right?
Right.
What does it mean to be an individual? What does it mean to have individual choices? Now, knowing what we know today, I think any sort of, any real reflection would tell us there are very few things that are truly individual choices.
Absolutely, yes.
We are guided by our upbringing, our experiences, the matter we consume, the peer groups that we are part of, all kinds of things, the nations we belong to. There are all kinds of frameworks that sit upon our so-called individuality or individualism. In my opinion, the biggest critique or the biggest attack that ought to happen on this kind of notion of secular individualism, which we call liberalism, is not even this, that it has all these frameworks and never really explores any of these frameworks. I have a deeper critique. My deeper critique is that this is entirely, the secular liberal framework is entirely focused externally. Now, what do I mean by that? I consider myself a liberal, I consider myself a liberal in the sense that I genuinely believe human beings should progressively evolve towards becoming more and more free, free of the, a deeper understanding of the human ties they have, and therefore only understanding can make you truly free, right? But also, all the sort of notions of the secular liberal framework is entirely guided towards trying to help the world. Therefore, you will see all the protests that happen in the world. They're all about trying to change the world, which is already well.
Right.
But there is very little understanding that unless what changes within,
Right.
the world will never change.
Absolutely. Yeah.
And this notion the West doesn't like because it seems too esoteric to them. That individuals must change from within in order to see the change, as Gandhi said,
Right.
in the world. And I think an Eastern framework helps you consistently to turn the gaze, to borrow a phrase from this entire decoloniality or whatever it's called these days. We must turn the gaze. Yes, we must turn the gaze and, go from colonial to decolonial, which is all very good. But the biggest turning of gaze must be from outside to inside. And it's the easiest thing to say some other countries to blame, some communities to blame, some whatever, one area or geographical area is to blame, one kind of government is to blame.
Right.
It's far tougher to analyze where we are going wrong ourselves. And I think if we were to build frameworks which enable or at least persuade in some small way to begin with human beings to turn the gaze inside and reflect upon their own behavior and choices, that is the beginning of building a truly egalitarian framework, a truly liberal framework. This external gaze is, in my opinion, one of the fundamental problems. And the East can come in and help by enabling us to build frameworks that focuses on the individual, but helps the individual to look within.
Sure, absolutely. And this is something that I also resonate with. But one of the strongest criticisms against an approach like this, and when you say Western frameworks, I feel like these frameworks have also increasingly become so popular in our own country,
course.
right? And the prism or the lens that is often used is a rights-based approach, right? Where, again, self-introspection is probably minimized. And the gaze is much more external, much more outwardly. So the criticism that I was talking about is more to do with the fact that, it's all right to talk about looking inward, etc. But going down that road, you are actually indirectly or perhaps even directly relieving the state or whoever it is that owes you certain benefits or entitlements from their responsibilities. right? Now, that's something that I get asked often in class. And to be fair, I think it's a fairly important criticism to negotiate, right? How do you respond to something like that?
So I think even that criticism, Malini, is again shifting the fundamental approach externally. That there is a state. I would actually dig down deeper and ask, the state owes us rights, right? What is the state and what are these rights? If we were to unpack this further, who makes up the state? How do they come to make up the state? Who enables them to make up the state? What structures, processes enable this journey towards people becoming the state? You will notice if we start to unpack all of these things, we will fundamentally again go back to individuals. So therefore, I don't have a problem with somebody saying, well, the state must give us X, Y, and Z. We are all saying that. I mean, I would not argue today that the state doesn't have a role to play in providing, in some senses, better primary education or better healthcare.
Right.
Gazing inwards doesn't help, a person who cannot access a bed in a public hospital
Right.
in that moment.
Right.
But, and there is no doubt that that's true, and
Yeah.
no one's to dispute that. But once that crisis is met,
Right.
for that crisis to be mitigated in the long term or for the long term, we must once again come to the question, who is responsible for that moment?
Yes.
Who is the state?
Right.
How did they become the state? What processes and mechanisms were applied? Who allowed that to happen? What frameworks were used? Once we start digging deeper and deeper, you will realize we will fundamentally again come to the question of individuals. I have this wonderful, I love this film. I wonder if you've seen it. It's on Netflix, called Two Popes.
No, I haven't.
So it's about the current pope, I mean fictionalized of course,
Right.
and his predecessor.
Okay.
And it's about the predecessor, Pope Ratzinger, and his conversation with the incumbent pope, right? And they have different approaches. So there's a moment when they're discussing violence and sexual crime within the church, and the current pope tells his predecessor, confession helps the person who's committed the crime. It does not much for the person who suffered the crime. So unless we can create a framework of justice, and we can create a framework of redemption within that justice,
Right.
but unless we drill down to individual behavior and where that individual behavior comes from, no long-term solution is ever possible. Because you see, you may today say, and this is why we are in the cycle of revolution and counter-revolution, right? Today somebody will come and say, we need a rights-based revolution. So 10 years will go by on that. Then there will be a counter-revolution saying, 50% of this money is disappearing.
Right.
So there will be a different kind of revolution, right? And that will be, something else. Then 10 years down the line, there'll be another. So we are trapped, there's this chapter in my new book on the Ashtavakra Gita, which is called We Are All Trishankus, and know the Trishanku story, Trishanku is stuck between heaven and earth.
Actually.
So
Yeah.
Trishanku is, stuck between heaven. He can neither rise up to heaven, nor can he fall to earth. And
Okay.
because, the gods won't let him, come to heaven, and a vigorous sage will not allow him to fall to earth, and so on and so
Okay.
forth. We are all stuck like that in a cycle of revolution and counter-revolution. Because we fundamentally are never stopping to delve deeper into why we behave the way we behave. What is human life for? What is indeed our purpose of human life?
Right.
Why are we behaving the way we behave? And all of these questions in your broad social sciences framework perhaps will immediately not be accepted. Perhaps will be accepted also in some curriculums in some universities. But broadly, the left-leaning academia and also right-leaning academia, they both look at these questions, with suspicion. One would say this is, like you said, this is basically, absolving the state of its sins.
Very
so to speak.
reductionist, right?
Yeah. And the other one would say, well, this is, no one cares about all of this, or what we need is really growth, and so on and so forth, right? But we are seeing that neither is able to give us a solution.
True.
I mean, to be very simplistic, it's almost like a communism, capitalism, quarrel.
Binary, right.
This binary is not, in fact,
right,
being able to give us a solution.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So I really think we should take a step back and try and understand why this does not give us a solution. We have tried for hundreds of years now to try and find a solution.
Sure.
And we haven't. So surely, I come from journalism and writing and history and so on and so forth, and you come from academia. None of these fields have any sort of sense of humility mostly. So therefore, perhaps reflection is not something that's very common.
Right.
But I do think it's time to take a step back.
Totally.
And try and understand, we've been teaching and we've been, proselytizing about these things for hundreds of years.
Right.
There hasn't been a solution. So now what?
True. Absolutely. That is so much food for thought. Thank you so much. Let's talk a little bit about your books. And, I was, even before this interview, of course, I knew about your accomplishments and the number of books that you'd written. But just before this interview today, I was looking up, your work, and I was absolutely struck by 12, the number, right? You have 12 books out already. You're probably just a year older than me, and I just have one, but that's a topic for another time. But what also struck me more is not so much about the number and the quantity of books that you've published, but also, the sheer diversity, right? It's absolutely amazing to see you write one book on Sardar Patel, which is obviously a biography, and you have something on political Hinduism, and then there's a book on Swami Vivekananda, there's something on geoeconomics. How do you possibly do this, right? What inspires you to write? How do you decide when to take on what?
You've just explained why I will never get a job at a university, because all formal academic structures look at people like me with deep suspicion. Mm-hmm. One of the great things I learned in, all these wonderful, great, and much flaunted and vaunted colleges that I went to was that everybody talks about being interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary, but nobody really genuinely likes somebody who's genuinely multidisciplinary, because each discipline is a fiefdom.
Yes.
And the dons that control that discipline,
are very, very
they don't
powerful.
like anybody coming and saying anything which they don't agree with, right?
Totally.
So it's all very well to teach young, students that, we must be interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary. But in fact, if somebody really were that way,
right,
you don't like, organized.
No, I'm actually, on the contrary, I'm in deep admiration.
No, look,
and I just want to know, how do you manage to do it?
Look, I think of it as very simply.
Mm-hmm.
I am genuinely interested in many things. Mm-hmm. And I think I bring us the skill, if it can be called a skill, of curiosity to everything that I do. Mm-hmm. In fact, and this is genuinely the truth, I have written many of these books because I wanted to know more about the subject. Like, I wrote the book on Sardar Patel because I wanted to know more about him.
Right.
So I feel that some of the books have really been an adventure to try and teach me that subject.
Right.
And as I have understood that subject, I've just written about it. Mm-hmm. Right.
But do the dots join, Hindol, for you?
They do. They do. Because, look, all of this is overlapping, and allow me, a few seconds to explain how. So, for instance, I wrote a book called Recasting India, which was nominated for the Hayek Prize and so on and so forth. Now, that was obviously a book on, essentially macro and microeconomics and, storytelling around it and so on, trade and economy and blah, 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 and startups and so on and so forth. When I wrote that book, one of the things I wrote in it is that the first instance, or one of the first instances of an organized economic strike was conducted in Gujarat against Aurangzeb.
Okay.
by the traders of Gujarat. There's a whole story about why and so on and so forth. I also wrote about the fact that while everybody knows about Rabindranath Tagore, very few people know about the accomplishments of Dwarkanath Tagore.
His grandfather.
And Dwarkanath wanted to bring really the power of the Industrial Revolution to the banks of the Hooghly.
Right.
Right?
Yeah.
Very
He had
few
his
people
own
know.
shipping business.
He had his own, so he had interest in shipping, he had interest in jute, he was a founding partner of a major bank.
Wow.
Lots of things, right?
Right.
I mean, there's a reason the Tagore family acquired that wealth,
Right.
right? Now, all of these things, all of these nuggets of history have society embedded in it. They have, in some parts, politics embedded in it. In some of these stories, there's religion.
Right.
So, if you plot out, if I were to make a scatter chart of my work, so to speak, you will see that the dots, the trend line would join.
Right.
In a sense, the trend line would show you how each of these things, talk to one another, speak to one another.
Right.
And I'm not suggesting every book of mine necessarily, is directly connected to the other. But I think I am really exploring ideas from India and of India. And many of these ideas are interconnected to one another. Like the book I wrote on political Hinduism, Soul and Sword. That, for instance, mentioned many of the revolutionaries, right? The revolutionary period of Indian history in Bengal. Now, the revolutionary period was dominated by figures who were fascinated by Upanishadic knowledge, right? If you look at, even early life of Aurobindo and so on and so forth. Many of these people, of course, Vivekananda, who once thought he was going to be a revolutionary, many of these people were really deeply influenced by what they thought of as India's core texts, and especially the Upanishads, right? Aurobindo, of course, went on to be a sage and so on and so forth. Now, when you read that story and when you read that history, you cannot not be interested in knowing more about the Bhagavad Gita, knowing more about the Upanishads, knowing more about, what Upanishadic idea translates to our world. And in a sense, that brought me to the latest book I've written, which is, on the Ashtavakra Gita.
Right.
And the Ashtavakra Gita is the most distilled version, they say, of the Advaitic Vedantic tradition, right? It is a book that Sri Ramakrishna asked Swami Vivekananda to read. It is a book that Ramana Maharishi spoke glowingly about. It is said that when all religions stop speaking, Ashtavakra begins to speak, so to speak.
Wow.
Right? And all of these things, therefore, you'll see, when I delve into one subject, I find things that make me interested in something else.
Right.
And they're all interconnected.
Right.
Now, I'm thinking of doing something, on goddess worship, right? On Shakti.
Right.
And, if you read, Aurobindo and you read Bhavani Mandir and I'm translating, I'm in the middle of translating Anandamath.
Wow.
Many Indians, and in fact, many Bengalis have also forgotten that Vande Mataram comes from Anandamath.
Anandamath, of course.
Right? And Anandamath is essentially about these warrior monks fighting in the forests. Right. So, all of this, at least in my head, they're all connected. And they're all connected by the fact that I am interested in various things.
Right.
I'm writing a new book on India as a civilizational state. Now, there are many ideas of people like Aurobindo or Vivekananda and a whole host of people, in the Swaraj and Ideas, that famous essay.
Right.
And many, many others. All of this will come. I recently helped start a annual lecture in the memory of Binoy Kumar Sarkar, the father of Indian international relations, right? He's the one who, gave us this mandala theory and this, that, and the other. So, people like Binoy Kumar Sarkar, K.C. Bhattacharjee, Aurobindo, Vivekananda, the whole bunch of people, right? Jadunath Sarkar, R.C. Mazumdar, they created a sort of fulcrum of ideas, and they were all polymaths. Many of them were interested in many things, and they understood how all of these things connected to one another. I think of my work a bit in that light.
Right.
That, my job is to help connect the dots and help us understand a little more deeply how all of these things come together to, in a sense, create what we call India.
Right. So your core identity would be that of a historian, despite all the hats that you wear. I know you've been into publishing and you're editor, and you have a stint with the government. Would being a historian be your core identity?
I think my core identity really is that of a seeker. Because I think history writing also is, yes, it's something that I do and I enjoy doing. But I fundamentally, Malini, and if this doesn't sound too esoteric to you, I fundamentally feel that I am looking for a higher state of being in my own life. I feel that all these great, sort of philosophers and sages we talk about in our own country, all of them were able to rise their own, sort of mundane existences.
Immediate existence, yes.
To a higher plane, whatever that higher plane
Absolutely.
is. I'm not suggesting that higher plane means go away to the Himalayas and sit there.
Right.
Some higher plane. How they reach that higher plane is something I'm interested in. And if in this lifetime I can push my life towards a direction where it moves to a slightly higher plane, that would be my, that is the summation of my work, or that is what that is my, according to me, that's my identity.
No, that's wonderful. And that makes so much sense, especially if you think of all the great thinkers that we encounter in the social sciences. And I'm just reminded of Aristotle. Does one club him as a biologist, an astronomer, a political scientist? I don't know, right? I mean, and it would be unfair to club him into any of these compartments, and which is why we call them philosophers. So whether it's an Aristotle or a Hegel or whoever it is, right? And it's a pity that with the advancement of modern education systems, this fracturing has become that much more acute. We almost feel compelled to bracket people, and now in the polarized times that we live in, and my next question is going to be about that, it's almost a compulsion to bracket people within certain isms, within certain camps. And given that you also write and you've spoken so much about political Hinduism, and which is my pet area, by the way, and I absolutely enjoy your work in that regard, does it ever, how difficult or easy has it been? And I say this all the more because I have been interested in Hindu nationalism myself, which obviously draws upon certain forms of political Hinduism. I'm deeply interested, intellectually interested in the Rashtriya Swayamsevak Sangh. And I must confess that it's not always been easy to write or to talk about these things, because you always are wondering if people are misinterpreting you, or worse so, is there a likelihood of you being misrepresented when somebody else is citing your work? How much of that pressure do you have to deal with?
Of course, the pressure exists. Let's not deny it, right?
But does it bother you?
I find that in many interviews I'm asked, what does it mean to be right-wing? And I've been saying for many years that I don't consider myself right-wing at all. There is literally, what is right-wing? If you look at the American right,
Right.
It's
a misnomer as far as India is concerned.
Yeah, and
totally,
what do I identify with the American right with?
Right.
Do I want to abolish abortion rights? Do I want to argue today that women don't have, first sort of, right to their own bodies? Do I deny that people should, or people, have indeed different approaches to sexuality,
Right.
and do I deny them those rights? No. So, do I believe, as some capitalists in some parts of the world believe, that, labor should get less and less rights and capital accumulation at extreme level is not a problem? No. Of course, I understand that many of these things have extremely harmful impact.
Right.
So, therefore, when people say right-wing, I think, let me just say this. Look, in India, a lot of these conversations are not, what is the polite way of putting it? They're not happening at a very enlightened level.
Absolutely.
Right?
Yes.
They are happening at the loudest level between people who least understand these things.
Yes.
People who talk about these things often have no understanding of what they're talking about. They have picked up phrases from various things that other people, usually from videos they have seen, short videos they have
Right.
seen, and they're just putting them out. After having fought many polemical battles in my life, I now feel that it's just all to be ignored. In fact, today, the so-called conservatives in India have attacked me much, much more than any of the so-called hard left ever did. Very recently, somebody was very unhappy that I used the word political Hinduism. I'm not sure. I'm not sure why, but they were unhappy. Who knows why? When I wrote the Patel book, people were very unhappy. Some people were very unhappy that I said that Patel and Nehru, while having great differences, also finally were part of a movement where they had actually spent all their lives with each other.
Exactly.
Their families were secondary.
Yeah.
That some people didn't like. Some others, of course, including some quote unquote eminent historians, didn't like the fact that, I mentioned that there's historical evidence that Patel and Nehru had extremely bitter divide on many, many issues,
Absolutely,
right?
yeah.
So, beyond the point, you come to the conclusion that you're never going to make everybody happy, and perhaps you're never going to make anybody happy.
Absolutely.
So therefore you write for yourself and then hope somebody will read it, and that's that,
Right. I think the problem lies with the fact that real life is actually much less dramatic than
Yes.
people would want it to be.
Yes.
I think real life is far more nuanced and complex
Yes.
than people would want it to be. And I think that is why a lot of us who engage in, issues and domains such as these find it incredibly difficult, because you probably spent years, and it's also a meditative process, right? Where you are coming from a certain intellectual worldview or an episteme, and just trying to convey that in 60,000 words through a book can be enormously difficult.
No, and
right?
also sometimes people don't want the truth, right? I mean,
Right.
people want their versions
Versions
of
of
the
the
truth.
truth,
Like when I wrote my
absolutely.
book on Vivekananda, some people were very unhappy that I said that he was not a vegetarian. But he was not a vegetarian. Now, what do we do about that? I mean, how do I change that?
Right.
Right? He was not a vegetarian. He was not a vegetarian.
Right.
But some other people were very unhappy that I said that he was so against a particular kind of conversion that once on a ship, he had some abuses thrown at
Yes.
Hinduism. He threatened to throw that pastor or
the
preach
sea, yeah.
in the sea.
Yeah.
Now, some people were deeply unhappy about that. Now, what do I do about this?
Right.
I mean, these are, anybody can go and verify if they have the time and inclination. They can go and
Absolutely.
verify these things.
Yes. Which is hard work, right? And that's not somewhere everyone wants to go.
So you see, people don't want the truth.
Yes.
They want their version of the truth so that they can project whatever they want to project.
Yes, and cherry pick what they want to take from that particular context. But that brings me to the next context, Hindol, which is, I've been hearing of late that, history is so divisive, and, history has actually played such a, let's say, rupturous role in the public domain right now. I, on the contrary, as a teacher, I keep telling my students that if you want to take the sting out of a debate, or a position rather, please historicize it.
Sure.
Because it's so much easier for them to then look at things not in such a black and white fashion, but to understand the complexities. So whether it's a uniform civil code or whatever else that is considered to be extremely volatile, right? It makes so much sense to, and the joke in my class is that I keep going back to the colonial period. I mean, of course, one can go even beyond that. But for me, those 200 years was so fundamental in reconfiguring the modern state, the Indian society, that I keep going back to the colonial period. And a lot of conversations around religion, around caste, and around current day politics actually starts making sense only when you're historicizing it seriously, right? So I just wanted to hear your thoughts on, do you think history, contrary to popular imagination now, can be more liberating than we have allowed it to be?
So I have a counter question for you. Who thinks history is too divisive?
I think there is a common public perception right now.
Okay.
I mean, I'm not talking about academics here or public intellectuals like you, obviously. But I do feel like in drawing room conversations, this
Like
often
general
comes up.
public.
General public, that's right. Or even in classrooms for that matter. Young students of mine, extremely sweet. But they do come up with this once in a while. Ma'am, history is so divisive, and look at what's going on in the world today.
So, again, I have another question. So, okay, history is divisive. So, what are we going to do about it? As in, it to me, it seems like a question that we can never resolve, right? So what are
Yes.
we going to do? I mean, we have to live with the history.
Yes.
We have to nuance how we engage with the history. Again, it goes back to my original point. But then the question is, who's going to do the nuancing?
Who's going to bell the cat? Yes.
Individuals.
Yes.
How will those individuals be enlightened enough to nuance an understanding of history, or their own understanding of history, nuance their own understanding of history, so that we build a sort of, balanced understanding? Well, by them being, you know, having a real sense of proportion, context. But all of this is the work that needs to happen inside.
Right.
We can say history is divisive, so some parts of history we will not look at all.
Right.
But that never works. Look, I mean, the Indian state tried to bury a part of our history for 60, 65 years or whatever more. But all of this comes out. History lives in the hearts and minds of people. And unless you cure the anxieties in those hearts and minds, history will come back. I mean, think about it. In the Middle East with the Abraham Accord, they had actually thought that they were on a cusp of a different kind of, Middle East, until October 7th happened. So, unless you go to the root causes and try and understand what is creating which problem, yes, we can hide some parts of history. I mean, for instance, the history that I was taught about India in school was extremely,
Insipid.
it was insipid. It was actually worse than insipid. It was just, I don't know, it was just very formless and characterless. It was just some incidents and dates
Events,
thrown at you.
right.
This happened and that happened, and the examination you had to mention this year and that year
Right.
and whatever. I don't think I was taught history in school, at least, with any deeper reflection of what all of this meant. And I understand that in school, at a school level, you cannot, go into, very great detail, but at least a richer understanding of what all of this means.
Right.
Right? Well, that's not the way I was taught history. And I don't think even today, in most schools in India or perhaps around the world, history is taught like that. It's taught in a very perfunctory way. See, that's what happens. I mean, today with social media, then those kids come out of school and college, and one day on Twitter, they see someone say something which they never didn't know.
Right.
And it's explosive in their head.
Yeah.
Because that one nugget of information
Yeah.
feels so explosive in their head.
Without any sense of the context or
Nothing.
what happened before, after.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So that then becomes a polemical point in their
Yes.
life.
Totally.
Right?
Yes.
And that's what converts into a particular kind of radicalism.
Absolutely.
Because they have no clue about what happened before, after, what was the nuance, what was the context. Like for instance, a whole bunch of people on Twitter really abuse Raja Ram Mohan Roy without any understanding of, Bengal of that time, what the coming of the press did to, the spread of certain kinds of published literature,
Right.
what people like Ram Mohan Roy and many others were seeing in a particularly, difficult time in Bengal's history, the decay that had set in. All of this is completely wiped out.
Totally. I mean, even when I'm teaching, scholars like, thinkers like Rousseau, for example,
Yeah.
or J.S. Mill, what I find really fascinating is, the student not diving, not all students, of course, but there is a tendency. I think it's also to do with a natural attraction towards controversial aspects of people's lives. And what I find fascinating is batch after batch, year after year, the focus always is on how Rousseau excludes women from the general will, how John Stuart Mill is talking of not, sensitive enough to the working class, and he's talking about how, the elite need to be granted, or the educated elite need to be, their vote needs to be given greater weightage. And I always tell them that, when you read with charity, because you're talking about a person who's living and who's writing in times that are very different from yours, right?
Yeah.
So 19th century John Stuart Mill talking about women's suffrage is a big deal. Rousseau talking about a general will at a time when there is no democracy is a big deal, right? So yeah, and it's unfortunate that the tendency continues.
Which is why a lot of the conversation in India also say about Gandhi. You know, I don't think a lot of people who talk about Gandhi have really delved deeper into Gandhi.
Right.
Right. In fact, many people who criticize Gandhi, and this is not to say that Gandhi shouldn't be criticized. You know, one
Right.
of the projects that I'm very interested in doing, if I can find the time, is a book called Versus Gandhi.
Wow.
You know, Gandhi, essentially the story, the history of his detractors,
Right.
and where they came from and
Right.
what they wanted to do, and
That
so on
would
and
be
so forth.
wonderful.
You know,
Yeah.
and why they didn't like what he said, and so on and so forth, right? But many of the people who, or some of the people at least, who don't like Gandhi today on Indian Twitter are making the same mistake that their opponents made about Savarkar. Distilled Savarkar down to one or two polemical points,
Right.
ignoring his entire history, his context, all of this. You know, there was this thing that people used to say, I guess people still say, oh, Savarkar wrote apology letters. Do you know the number of people who wrote such letters from Kalapani?
Right.
You know, do you even know what Kalapani was?
Was.
What human beings were made to endure in
Right.
Kalapani? So, without understanding all of that, you will never understand. And you have to understand, what did he do once he came out? It's not like he became a British stooge. So, the same with Gandhi, right? I mean, of course, there are many things that one can, in retrospect, criticize Gandhi for. And you know, I have myself mentioned many of these things in my writings. But I always encourage and I urge a deeper reading of Gandhi, because I think Gandhi, as far as India is concerned, will always be with us.
Absolutely.
Because there are certain Gandhian values that are very core to the Bharatiya way of thinking.
Totally.
Right? And to believe that we will one day erase Gandhi is a mistake. Like, for instance, the attempt to erase Savarkar or Patel and so on and so forth, especially Savarkar, from history has failed. You know, lo behold, I mean, Savarkar is, you know, more alive than ever before among us, right? So this kind of erasure is fundamentally problematic. I think we should encourage deeper and contextual understanding of all of these people, so that we understand that to judge them very quickly in a knee-jerk fashion using today's polemical Instagram and Twitter-based lenses is just asinine. It makes no sense.
Absolutely.
Right? You know, today, and this always happens. You pick up whatever is in fashion politically, and then you use that lens
Right.
to look back a few hundred years
Yes.
and judge everybody,
Yes.
which
Yes.
is just stupid.
Absolutely.
You know, there's just no other word for it.
True. All right. So I'll just go back quickly to your book, The Liberals,
Yeah.
which I have read, and I was
I'm
particularly
so happy. You know, that book is one of my very early works, and I think that's the most personal book I've written
I
till
think
date.
so too. It is some of those essays, you know, give us very deep, you know, almost personal insights into your own life.
Yes.
And also because I've spent some time in Kolkata and I
Yes.
have a house there too, you know, I could resonate with a lot of, you know, the local jargons and the
Yes.
vocabulary that you were using. You talk about the culvert on and off.
Yes.
And your mother's reaction to it, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. There's one part of that
Yes.
essay, I think, where you talk about your own struggles with science,
Yes.
right? And I hope you won't mind me saying
No, not
this,
at
but
all.
you say in that book that your parents sort of tried to nudge you towards,
Yes.
you know, studying science.
That's right.
But your heart was always in the humanities, and
Quite right.
you would also write poetry.
Yes.
And which is another minor question, by the way. I would love to, you know, read your poetry books getting published next. But nevertheless, coming back to the more fundamental question I have is, you know, today with the new education policy, you know, there is again a rethinking about how this binary hasn't been helpful to any of us, right? So science students have to study science, and the arts, humanities, social science folks are, you know, and how now the NEP is also talking about the value of sort of marrying these two words, these two epistemes. Given that a lot of our viewers are, you know, young students, what would you have to say about, you know, why is it so important to break that binary? And given your body of work, I think there is no greater testimony to the fact that, you know, once you acquire the right technique, you have the right sort of methodology, it's actually not only possible, but I think both these worlds benefit from each other, right? The legal rational world of science and finance, vis-a-vis the world of humanities and arts, right?
No, I completely agree. Both the sciences and the humanities make a big deal about themselves, right? I mean, today on Twitter, I read constantly that, the worst thing that has ever been done to the IITs is to have all these humanities courses in the IITs, and that's what destroying it, and, we will no longer build great companies because all these, the great minds of who would have built our Silicon Valley, and since we're sitting in Bangalore, we
Right.
should talk about this, would have built and gone on to build our great, companies in technology are all being spoilt by all this
Yeah.
idiocy from the social sciences and so on and so forth. And of course, the humanities students think all these like, cyber coolies and so on and so forth, who
Right.
have no understanding,
About the world,
about the world or
yeah.
anything. That's not helpful.
Right.
Look, it is true that different people have an aptitude for different things. I would have never been a good engineer, right? I would have at best been a workable, competent engineer. I would have never been a great coder. I would have been at best being a competent coder. Those are not things that's not my natural aptitude.
Right.
Having said that, a lot of stuff that people make a big deal about, like in finance and stuff. Look, most people who have a rudimentary understanding and are good in maths and so on and so forth know how to do a basic financial model, and they know it's basically great Excel skills,
Yes.
right? And my Excel skills really suck. I was taught how to use Excel, but I never really got the hang of it. It's embarrassing, I shouldn't be saying this on camera, but but the fact is, it's not such a big deal. And, you will see, Malini, with the coming of AI, a lot of this will change.
Absolutely.
Because a lot of the things that have been kept in all these sort of silos and towers that, I know how to do this.
Yes.
And this is so secretive and
Yes.
this is so amazing
Yes.
that you will never understand
Almost
it.
like a secret recipe that needs to be guarded and protected from. Yeah.
All of this will disappear.
Absolutely.
There might not be any need. If today I had a sort of suitably advanced AI tool, I may just have to feed in some numbers, perhaps not even that, to get a basic model out.
Yes.
Right? So all those great Excel skills and this, that, and the other
Right.
is meaningless.
Yes.
Again, similarly, very few people are going to become Rabindranath Tagore.
Right.
Let's face it.
Yeah.
Very few people are going to, really be path-breaking social scientists, right? Most people are going to be middling and average.
Right.
Now, to suggest that those skills cannot be acquired by somebody, AI will prove that wrong.
Right.
AI will soon prove that most of the essays written by most of the stuff that is being published around the world,
Right.
AI will soon be able to do a better job.
Right. But AI aside, Hindol, I'm also thinking that I think the lens or the prism that the social science / humanities bring to the table, which is often not acknowledged enough, right, by the techies, for lack of any other term.
Sure.
It
I can see which side you're on.
Yes, it can be absolutely devastating because I have engineer students in the class, and the first time in the class when they're hearing about, or rather delving into conversations around caste, around religion, around gender, they're like, oh my God, it was happening all around me, but it's almost like I'm wearing a new, pair of spectacles now. I see the world differently. So, it was there that I was coming from.
Yeah.
But anyhow, I just have one
No, but I just want to make that point.
Please.
I mean, that's a very good point. Look, of course, as you point out, there is merit to introducing people to width.
Yes.
Any, expansion of dimension in the
horizon,
mind
absolutely,
is a good thing.
Yes.
For the techies, for the social sciences, actually, I think some of the best social science people, if they understood tech, would create some of the, least invasive applications for us.
Right.
It's because, we didn't have enough people who were cognizant of many of the,
ethicality of,
and this will be, again, very important as AI advances,
Right.
because what are the morals and ethics of an AI-driven
Absolutely,
world, right?
yes.
So we need those people on the table.
For those sensibilities.
For those
Yes,
sensibilities.
absolutely.
However, I'm also cognizant of the fact that where the criticism comes from. The criticism comes from the fact that if we delve very deeply only into the, the question of caste and, I mean, it's useful to a particular degree.
Yes.
Again, everything is about proportionality and context. Taking anything too far, I don't think serves purpose.
Right.
Beyond the point, we will always be in a world where some people will be very good at building technologies and some people will be very good at social science research and writing books and so on and so forth, right? That's the nature of the that's the nature of human existence and the world that we live in. But definitely any expansion of horizon is very helpful with some checks and balances.
Right, absolutely. All right, I would love to go on and on, but I have one last question, and this is especially for our students at Azim Premji University, many of whom are pursuing arts and humanities, social sciences. And I would want you, I mean, in one way, for me, somebody like you, a public intellectual like you, and your entire body of work is, testimony to the fact that, with the social science / humanities, education, you can actually go places, right? And now, while I know that, students these days know about it, but I think it would be, the validation coming from somebody like you would be really useful. So do you have a message for?
No, I mean, it would be very presumptuous of me and extremely pompous of me to try and, I will give some message and the next thing, your students are going to be cutting out that and making memes of that and putting it on Instagram. And all those memes will be tagged to me only. So I, I shy away from giving a message. But let me say this though. I think one of the best things that happened to me early was an education in journalism. And I got educated in lots of things, in history and in finance and IR and this, that and the other. In film, I still make films, by the way. I make documentary films. I just made one on a Buddhist monk and so on and so forth. But what journalism did for me was make me curious about a whole bunch of things. I think what happens in academia when people follow one path is their curiosity about other things die out. And they often tend to think of other things as lesser than their stream. See, history writing has become a bit like that, right? Academic history has become about people slicing and dicing even narrower, strands of history and going into that. So the big picture history, it's almost looked down on in academia. That, this sprawling history, the
Bailey kind of history.
Yeah, and I love the Bailey kind of history, right? So, it's only the, some people who are still, there's Peter Frankopan is still writing that kind of history and he's still an academic,
and he's still an academic. I like that one.
It's true. I mean, I had lunch with Peter Frankopan when I was at Oxford and, I actually asked him that and he was like, this, big picture history and so on and so forth. And he had a great answer. He was like, look, number one, those kind of books that he writes are meant to be read by lots and lots of people. They're not meant for a curriculum use, so to speak. And he really thought that this kind of global history had great meaning for a time when we are becoming more siloed than ever before. And I completely agree with him.
Absolutely.
Sprawling history of the kind that Peter Frankopan writes is very, very useful, particularly at a time like this, So I think that curiosity is a very important strand.
Right.
Academia today, sadly, works in a particular way that, again, to go back to the early point that I made, gives people a false sense of superiority above other streams.
Right.
They feel that if I know this, that's it. I know this and that's enough.
Yeah, and I should quickly add that, there's so much, whatever you were saying in the last 5 minutes resonates with our university's philosophy, right? And if you look at the pedagogic techniques that we use, the curriculum that we use, the idea of not trying to value academic knowledge over practitioners' knowledge. I mean, that's one thing that's been sort of consistent since the establishment of the university. And I feel so privileged to be part of a community where I'm teaching courses perhaps with somebody who comes from a non-academic space, has worked in a village, let's say for 20, 30 years. And the whole idea is for us to not prioritize any of these knowledge forms, but to really come to a common place where we're just trying to make the world slightly better than it
Which is why they've
It is
created
right
this
now.
whole professor of practice, so to speak,
Absolutely,
right? Yeah.
yes. We have practitioners of development, we have professors of practice, and even the MA Dev program, the development program,
Yeah.
the MA education program, the undergrad programs, they have a very strong field component, right? And that's not just to pay lip service to the idea of field experience, but we really tell students that field is serious work. It is as important as what you're learning in the classroom, right? So I'm absolutely excited to hear all of what you said, especially in the last 5 minutes, because that's spot on with what we believe
And
in.
you're a very good ambassador of Azim Premji University. Malini, if you bring back the glorious Bangalore weather and offer me a job, I will come and teach at your university. And
You are most welcome
you've
and
done a wonderful
anytime.
job of pitching the university. It was fantastic. I told you,
But
if you bring back the glorious Bangalore
yeah, if
weather.
there are any students watching this, and yeah, I just want to say that the humor aside, I think it's a fascinating place to be in. But it was so good talking to you,
Thank
Hindol,
you. Thank you so
and
much,
this was
Malini.
absolutely wonderful. You've been so candid, and one of the things that I really enjoyed about our conversation is, this was you were not trying to be politically correct. You were not trying to quote unquote balance opinions, and that was so refreshing at a time and age like this. So thank you
Thank you
so
very much
much.
for inviting me. I'm always very happy to come to Bangalore. The food is wonderful. The weather used to be wonderful, will become
Yes,
wonderful again. But thank you very
better.
much for
Thank you so much for your
inviting me.
time.
I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Same here. Thank you.